Hey everybody, and Tony here with my review of Verdi's La Forza del Destino with once again conductor Paolo Carignani, which I saw at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. This marks the second time I practically tortured myself with Frank Kastorf's production of Verdi's La Forza del Destino at the Deutsche Oper Berlin because I wanted to see and hear Ante Jerkunica perform the role of Padre Guardiano. It's no surprise that I've been following Ante Jerkunica's career for about 9 to 10 years now. I have seen him grow from strength to strength with a lot of the basso cantante / basso profondo roles that he has been singing, and I've always loved the plushness of his low notes and chest tones, and of course, that deep, dark register that made him stand tall. And speaking of standing tall, I also love his stage presence because of how tall, commanding, and strong he has always been on stage, whether it be with roles such as Marcel from Les Huguenots, or even Sarastro from the Zauberflöte, let alone as Jacopo Fiesco from Verdi's Simon Boccanegra, and even tonight as Padre Guardiano, which his performance in that role was no exception. So while I can sing praises of his tall and strong stage presence and his equally plush low tones and even those chest tones that were nice, round, and rich, I was not crazy about how he was attacking those high notes because there were occasions, and that has always been a problem that he has been having, especially when attacking those high notes, is that they sound strained, they sound ill-supported, and they sound quite strident. Therefore, the connection between his low notes, his middle notes, and his high notes sounds completely disjointed and unpleasant to listen to, which is a huge shame because Ante Jerkunica always had great material to work with. It's just a shame that his vocal inconsistencies mar such an otherwise stirring performance given his tall stage presence and the plushness that he has with his low notes. Regardless of whatever caveat Ante Jerkunica had as a singing actor, I could still give him credit for what he was able to do with Padre Guardiano in terms of giving him a stern, tall stage presence and even back it up with a sufficiently plush voice that had good low notes and an equally good round timbre that I love in many a basso cantante / basso profondo. Is he anywhere good as Alexander Kipnis, Ezio Pinza, Tancredi Passero, Jerome Hines, Giorgio Tozzi, Cesare Siepi, Nikolai Gyaurov, Bonaldo Giaiotti, and Evgeny Nesterenko? Not by a long shot. But his signature commanding stage presence, backed up by some crude low notes, as well as depth to his voice, managed to make him stand out quite well, although the vocal flaws that Ante Jerkunica had cannot be denied at all. Nevertheless, I still have to salute him for what he was able to do with Padre Guardiano, as well as his contributions to that particular role. Steven Bronk was actually a lot better as Marchese di Calatrava this time. Yes, there is still that weatheredness and that wear and tear in his voice, given the fact that he has been singing for a very long time, but he still had sufficiently good technique in which he was able to make the best out of this otherwise thankless character, and he was able to use that strong and tall stage presence to his advantage to bring in that command and that strength, let alone that virility and that plushness in his voice and even his stage presence to make the best out of the Marquis de Calatrava. So bravo to Steven Bronk for continuing to do a fine job as this particular father figure and making the best out of this particularly ungrateful role. Patrick Rowan was still solid as the mayor, also known as Jimmy, but what I seem to notice, and this is one thing that I kind of forgot to bring up in my previous review of Forza del Destino, is that he has a caprino that makes his voice otherwise sound annoying to listen to, but if I could take that caveat out of the way, there's still a fine voice that Mr. Rowan has. It's just that his caprino tends to be kind of irritating, and if he could develop his voice in the right way and eliminate the caprino, I'm sure that we will have a bass baritone worthy of praise and acclaim. There's still a lot of potential to be found with Patrick Rowan as a fine singing actor, as long as he continues to develop his voice in the right way, because there is a nice color to be found in his bass baritone voice. It's just that I don't want his caprino to be too much of a hindrance for his singing career. That caveat aside, Patrick Rowan was still a fine mayor who was able to take advantage of not only his voice to make this role stand out, but also give him a fair amount of authority as well as a strong personality to boot. I am still not crazy about Philip Yekal as Fra Militone. His voice was still too lyrical and still too light and still too high for such a role that demands either a bass baritone, a basso buffo, or even that of a baritone with good low notes. He pales in comparison to the likes of Fernando Correnna, Ezio Flagello, and even Sesto Bruscantini, and lest I forget about Alfredo Mariotti, who also ranks alongside Ezio Flagello as one of my most favorite interpreters of Fra Militone of all time. In fact, I would even argue that Philippe Yekal is more suitable to singing roles such as Valentin from Faust, Mercutio from Romeo et Juliet, Frédéric from Lakmé, and Morales from Carmen, not something as deep and rich such as Fra Militone. And the other issues I have with Philippe Yekal in that particular role is that he tries to sound rich and deep, but the result is that he had the tendency to bark, and he had the tendency to sound unsupported and nasal and masky. It also doesn't help that he sounds too tenorish for my tastes in that particular role, and I firmly believe that he should not have touched this role to begin with, but continued his career as a lyric baritone. If I wanted a deeper, richer voice to sing Fra Militone, I would have gone for Misha Kiria, or even Nicola Alaimo, because at least Misha Kiria and Nicola Alaimo have sufficiently deep and plush baritone voices that have those low notes, that have the ideal size in order to sing this role. And if we're talking about buffo singers who also sang this role, look no further than not only Fernando Correnna, but also Gustav Neidlinger, who was also a very well-known interpreter of Alberich. But all of the major issues I had with Philippe Yekal as Fra Militone aside, there is still some credit to be given in terms of how he was able to bring out that roguishness and that cantankerousness without going too over the top. It's just a shame that his light lyric baritone voice could not really make this role come alive that well, let alone effectively. And when I think of singers singing Fra Militone, I think of much deeper voices who could pull off that role well. And while I do believe that he should not have touched Fra Militone at all, at least I can give Philippe Yekal some credit for what he was able to do in terms of really tackling that role with everything that he's got, although the results were extremely hit or miss at best. Nevertheless, I could still applaud him for his bravery for at least tackling that role. Roman Burdenko was certainly a lot stronger as Don Carlo de Vargas, thus making his performance as Don Carlo way better than when I first heard him 2 days ago. There was a much cleaner and clearer attack on the high notes. His high A's sounded more incisive, and there was just a lot more vocal acting to be found as Don Carlo. Yes, he is nowhere near to the levels of the great Don Carlos ever, in my opinion, being Robert Merrill, Giuseppe Taddei, Cornell McNeil, Gian Giacomo Guelfi, Silvano Carolli, Giorgio Zancanaro, Ettore Bastianini, Lawrence Tibbett, and Leonard Warren. But what he had going for him was sufficient machismo, sufficient strength, whether it be in the low notes or in the middle notes or in the top notes, and especially his top notes, and a whole lot of dark, virile, and absolutely manly charisma that he was able to imbue with Don Carlo de Vargas. In fact, his top notes reminded me of Cheryl Milnes and how he attacked those high notes, but I would argue that Cheryl Milnes' attack on the high notes is a lot clearer and more clarion and far more precise, as well as sharper. Roman Burdenko's attacks on the high notes were sharp and clear, no doubt about that. But he could not hold a candle to Cheryl Milnes, but he kind of falls short on what Cheryl Milnes could accomplish. Nevertheless, Roman Burdenko was vocally and theatrically exciting as Don Carlo de Vargas, although he does not reach the level of Robert Merrill, Giuseppe Taddei, Cornell McNeil, and Jean-Jacques Guelfi as my most favorite interpreters of Don Carlo de Vargas of all time. Therefore, I could still salute Signore Burdenko for what he was able to accomplish as Don Carlo de Vargas. Striking again was Jorge de Leon as Don Alvaro, and once again, he managed to take advantage of his signature clarion voice to make it ring throughout the theater, and he also used that trademark steeliness to make his voice come alive with everything he's got. Yes, there is still that wobble that otherwise mars his overall great vocal performance, but that is an extremely small price to pay because Jorge de Leon's voice is still as exciting as ever, and he still manages to bring in that stentorian quality that makes him very charismatic and virile as a singing actor. Yes, he is nowhere near the supreme vocal acting found in great tenors such as Giovanni Zenatello, Giovanni Martinelli, Galliano Massini, and even Mario Del Monaco, who is actually one of my most favorite interpreters of Don Alvaro ever, especially when he ranks alongside Galliano Massini in that particular role. But I could still argue that Jorge de Leon's vocal excitement, as well as that sufficient virility and how much he was able to make that metallic voice of his shine throughout the theater, was absolutely a feat that he managed to pull off so well. So I'll still continue to salute Jorge de Leon for what he was able to accomplish as Don Alvaro, and here's hoping that he will continue to stay as consistent as a vocal performer, despite his flaws. Ya-Chung was also stronger as Mastro Trabucco, and yes, there was that occasional nasality and maskiness that I still had an issue with, and it would be great if he got rid of that maskiness and nasality to make this role come alive with everything that he's got. But regardless of that vocal caveat, Ya-Chung continues to be as exciting and as thrilling as a vocal actor with everything that he's got. So I also have to give him a lot of kudos for what he was able to accomplish as Mastro Trabucco. What more can I say about Byung-gil Kim as the surgeon? He was still able to do a fine job with that small character part, and I'd also like to hear him one day as Padre Guardiano, let alone as the Marchese di Calatrava, because his voice, as I stated before in my review when he sang Ramphis, he has that crudeness and that dark quality that goes on the grayish side, but not in a bad way, but in an interesting way that could make his voice shine in all of these anti-heroic parts. Yes, I made the argument that I would have loved to hear him as Padre Guardiano one day, but only if he manages to continue developing his voice in the right way and in the best way possible, as well as take inspiration from Ezio Pinza, Alexander Kipnis, Tancredi Passero, Jerome Hines, Cesare Siepi, Giorgio Tozzi, and Nikolai Gyaurov, unless they forget about Bonaldo Jaiotti and Evgeny Nesterenko. Because Byung-gil Kim can sing the basso cantante parts as long as he develops his voice in the best way possible, and there is that potential for him to keep on growing as a singing actor. So I still have to salute him for what he was able to accomplish as the surgeon. Hulkar Sabirova was actually better this time as Leonora de Vargas, although I'm still not convinced that her voice could suit Leonora de Vargas's big, dramatic, and monumentally challenging lines. I've always argued that Hulkar Sabirova is far more suitable for the more florid singing in the bel canto repertoire as well as the early Verdi roles. Nevertheless, she was technically proficient. She was able to be a lot more cognizant with her technique as well as take good advantage of her coordinated head voice. And although I am not crazy about how she sang her chest tones, as there were times that they sounded hollow and they sounded rather unsupported, I could still give Hulkar Sabirova credit where credit is due in terms of her dramatic flair and in terms of bringing both strength, vulnerability, and a lot of human beauty to Leonora de Vargas. She may never approach Celestina Boninsegna's true heroism found in her chest tones, let alone Maria Canilla's gorgeous tones that also have chestiness and strength, or even Gina Chinia's incisive quality, as well as the complete packages found in Renata Tebaldi and Maria Callas. Nevertheless, Hulkar Sabirova was in a class of her own. It's just that Leonora de Vargas is not a role for her. I would rather hear her as Ana Bolena, Maria Stuarda, Elisabetta from Roberto de Vereux, Giselda from I Lombardi, Elvira from Ernani, Giovanna d'Arco, Luisa Miller, Amalia from Imas Nadieri, Mimi from La Boheme, Cho-Cho-san from Madama Butterfly, Sutzel from L'Amico Fritz, and even Lodoletta. Those roles, as I would argue, would be more suitable for Hulkar Sabirova these days, instead of something as huge, demanding, and big, such as Leonora de Vargas. Regardless, at least I could salute her for being a trooper in this role, and at least she was still able to bring in some sufficient vocal beauty to Leonora's pianissimi singing, as well as some grace to be found in La Vergine dell'Angeli, as well as Madre Pietosa Vergine. Although let's face it, I would have loved to have a lot more chestiness, depth, and richness, as well as additional incision in her voice. But taking those caveats aside, Hulkar Sabirova was still as dedicated as a singer as she's always been. Yana Kurutsova manages to be as solid as ever as Preziosilla, and her voice still had that nice, pleasant quality to it, with sufficient vocal strength in the upper register, as well as how she was able to handle the coloratura. And there is that great potential for her to sing more Falcon roles. However, I'm still missing that steeliness that I love in voices such as Aurelia Dominguez, Elena Nicolai, Ebe Stignani, Gianna Pederzini, and my most personal favorite interpreter of the role, Giulietta Simeonato. It also says something that the likes of Genia Gusletsevich, Marta Mödel, Sigrid Kiel, and Helga Dernesch had far more chest voice than Yana Kurutsova could ever accomplish, and were far more well-coordinated singers compared to her. Nevertheless, Yana Kurutsova has wonderful material to work with. She had a sufficiently agile voice to make the role of Preziosilla come to life, and she was still able to bring in grace and beauty to this otherwise thankless and rather useless character. And I'm sure that if Yana Kurutsova continues to develop her technique in the best way possible, I could definitely see her sing the more Falcon roles. Roles like Brangena from Tristan und Isolde, Sieglinde from Die Walküre, Kundry from Parsifal, Santuzza from Cavalleria Rusticana, Chimène from Le Cid, Didon from Le Toyon, and even Venus from Tannhäuser. These are definitely roles I could see her in once Yana Kurutsova continues to develop her voice in the best way possible, and even make sure that her coordination between chest voice and head voice continues to be as strong and solid as ever. When all is said and done, I could still salute Yana Kurutsova for continuing to bring in sufficient beauty as Preziosilla. Karis Tucker continued to be as fine as ever as Kura, although I really would love her to develop her chest tones a lot more, because she had the tendency to sound quite woofy, which is a major shame because Karis Tucker has wonderful material to work with, and I'm sure that if she continues to develop her voice in the right way, complete with chest tones, and more coordination between head voice and chest voice, we could have a fine mezzo-soprano who could also tackle Preziosilla one day. The future still looks wonderful for Karis Tucker, and I would love to keep on hearing her in more leading lady roles. Rory Mathiel, whether you like him or not, was still charismatic as an actor, although, as I will always argue, his presence on stage could be better suited in another show, let alone in something other than this. And even though his presence as the Indio was quite distracting to watch, at least there was that charisma that he had, but it's better used somewhere else and in another play. So overall, the singing still varied from quality to quality, but I still have to give credit where credit was due, with Ante Jerkunica using his low notes to the best of his abilities, especially to bring in reverence and grace as Padre Guardiano. Yes, he does fall short as to what he could accomplish in that particular role, let alone his talents as a singing actor, but I could still give him credit for what he was able to do with his strong stage presence and what he was able to bring with this priest. And I also have to give it to all the singers who were able to give it their all in this final performance of Verdi's La Forza del Destino, at least of the season. The conducting done by Paolo Carignani continues to be as excellent as ever. There was not one moment where I thought a note was sour, and there was not one moment where I thought that something went awry, and everybody went together, and you could always rely on the chorus and orchestra of the Deutsche Oper Berlin to amp up everything in this particular performance and in every performance that they're in. So overall, while I can give credit where credit is due to Ante Jerkunica in terms of his great low notes as well as his tall and commanding stage presence, there were still some issues that I had with his voice, such as his strident high notes, as well as that tendency to sound rather woofy and woolly. Regardless, Ante Jerkunica still had his trademark stage presence to make Padre Guardiano come alive as a character, and everybody from Hulkar Sabirova to Jorge de Leon to Roman Burdenko to Byung-gil Kim to Ya-Chung Huang to Philip Yekel to Karis Tucker, and to everybody who contributed in the cast of La Forza del Destino managed to do serviceable jobs in everything that they've done in their respective roles. Yes, there were flaws here and there, but that is not to take away the talents that each of them had, as well as the potential that each of them have to keep on growing as singers as well as overall performers. And for those of you who saw this particular production of Verdi's La Forza del Destino at the Deutsche Oper Berlin, what'd you think of it? Did you really like Ante Jerkunica's singing voice as Padre Guardiano? Was there another singer who stole his thunder? Or did you feel like his singing in that particular role was not good at all? Please comment below and let me know. Well, that's it for my review of Verdi's La Forza del Destino at the Deutsche Oper Berlin, starring Ante Jerkunica as Padre Guardiano. Tune in tomorrow for my review of Puccini's Tosca, also at the Deutsche Oper Berlin, starring Erwin Schrott as Baron Vitello Scarpia. So until then, good night everybody, and happy Easter!